The Call of the Canyon by Zane Grey. Chapter 11, Part 1. Carley burst in upon her aunt. "Look at me, Aunt Mary," she cried, radiant and exultant. "I'm going back out West to marry Glenn and live his life." The keen old eyes of her aunt softened and dimmed. "Dear Carley, I've known that for a long time. You've found yourself at last." Then Carley breathlessly babbled her hastily formed plans, every word of which seemed to rush her onward. "You're going to surprise Glenn again?" queried Aunt Mary. "Oh, I must. I want to see his face when I tell him." "Well, I hope he won't surprise you," declared the old lady. "When did you hear from him last?" "In January. It seems ages. But, Aunt Mary, you don't imagine Glenn—" "I imagine nothing," interposed her aunt. "It will turn out happily and I'll have some peace in my old age. But, Carley, what's to become of me?" "Oh, I never thought," replied Carley, blankly. "It will be lonely for you, Auntie. I'll come back in the fall for a few weeks. Glenn will let me." "Let you? Ye gods! You've come to that! Imperious Carley Burch! Thank Heaven you'll now be satisfied to be let do things." "I'd crawl for him," breathed Carley. "Well, child, as you can't be practical, I'll have to be," replied Aunt Mary, seriously. "Fortunately for you, I'm a woman of quick decision. Listen. I'll go West with you. I want to see the Grand Canyon. Then I'll go on to California, where I have old friends I've not seen for years. When you get your new home all fixed up I'll spend a while with you. And if I want to come back to New York now and then I'll go to a hotel. It is settled. I think the change will benefit me." "Auntie, you make me very happy. I could ask no more," said Carley. Swiftly as endless tasks could make them, the days passed. But those on the train dragged interminably. Carley sent her aunt through to the canyon while she stopped off at Flagstaff to store innumerable trunks and bags. The first news she had of Glenn and the Hutters was that they had gone to the Tonto Basin to buy hogs and would be absent at least a month. This gave birth to a new plan in Carley's mind. She would doubly surprise Glenn. Wherefore she took counsel with some Flagstaff business men and engaged them to set a force of men at work on the Deep Lake property, making the improvements she desired, and hauling lumber, cement, bricks, machinery, supplies, and all the necessities for building construction. Also she instructed them to throw up a tent house for her to live in during the work, and to engage a reliable Mexican man with his wife for servants. When she left for the canyon she was happier than ever before in her life. It was near the coming of sunset when Carley first looked down into the Grand Canyon. She had forgotten Glenn's tribute to this place. In her rapturous excitement of preparation and travel the canyon had been merely a name. But now she saw it and she was stunned. What a stupendous chasm, gorgeous in sunset color on the heights, purpling into mystic shadows in the depths. There was a wonderful brightness of all the millions of reds and yellow and gray surfaces still exposed to the sun. Carley did not feel a thrill because feeling seemed inhibited. She looked and looked, yet was reluctant to keep on looking. She possessed no image in mind with which to compare this grand and mystic spectacle. A transformation of color and shade appeared to be going on swiftly, as if gods were changing the scenes of a titanic stage. As she gazed, the dark fringed line of the north rim turned to burnished gold, and she watched that with fascinated eyes. It turned rose. It lost its fire. It faded to quiet, cold gray. The sun had set. Then the wind blew cool through the pinyons on the rim. There was a sweet tang of cedar and sage on the air, and that indefinable fragrance peculiar to the canyon country of Arizona. How it brought back to Carley remembrance of Oak Creek. In the west, across the purple notches of the abyss, a dull gold flare showed where the sun had gone down. In the morning at 8 o'clock there were great irregular black shadows under the domes and peaks and escarpments. Bright Angel Canyon was all dark, showing dimly its ragged lines. At noon there were no shadows, and all the colossal gorge lay glaring under the sun. In evening Carley watched the canyon as again the sun was setting. Deep dark blue shadows, like purple sails of immense ships, in wonderful contrast with the bright sunlit slopes, grew and rose toward the east, down the canyons and up the walls that faced the west. For a long while there was no red color, and the first indication of it was a dull bronze. Carley looked down into the void, at the sailing birds, at the precipitous slopes and the dwarf spruces and the weathered old yellow cliffs. When she looked up again, the shadows out there were no longer dark. They were clear. The slopes and depths and ribs of rock could be seen through them. Then the tips of the highest peaks and domes turned bright red. Far to the east she discerned a strange shadow, slowly turning purple. One instant it grew vivid, then began to fade. Soon after that all the colors darkened, and slowly the pale gray stole over all. At night Carley gazed over and into the black void. But for the awful sense of depth, she would not have known the canyon to be there. A soundless movement of wind passed under her. The chasm seemed a grave of silence. It was as mysterious as the stars, and as aloof and as inevitable. It had held her sense of beauty and proportion in abeyance. At another sunrise, the crown of the rim, a broad belt of bare rock, turned pale gold under its fringed dark line of pines. The tips of the peak gleamed opal. There was no sunrise red, no fire. The light in the east was a pale gold under a steely green blue sky. All the abyss of the canyon was soft gray transparent, and the belt of gold broadened downward, making shadows on the west slopes of the mesas and escarpments. Far down in the shadows she discerned the river, yellow, turgid, palely gleaming. By straining her ears, Carley heard a low, dull roar as of a distant storm. She stood fearfully at the extreme edge of a stupendous cliff, where it sheered dark and forbidding, down and down into what seemed red and boundless depths of Hades. She saw gold spots of sunlight on the dark shadows, proving that somewhere, impossible to discover, the sun was shining through wind-worn holes in the sharp ridges. Every instant Carley grasped a different effect. Her studied gaze absorbed an endless changing. And at last she realized the sun and light and stars and moon and night and shade all working incessantly and mutably over shapes and lines and angles and surfaces too numerous and too great for the sight of man to hold, made an ever-changing spectacle of supreme beauty and colorful grandeur. She talked very little while at the canyon. It silenced her. She had come to see it at the critical time of her life and in the right mood. The superficialities of the world shrunk to their proper insignificance. Once she asked her aunt, "Why did not Glenn bring me here?" As if this canyon proved the nature of all things. But in the end Carley found that the rending strife of the transformation of her attitude toward life had insensibly ceased. It had ceased during the long watching of this cataclysm of nature, this canyon of gold-banded, black-fringed ramparts, and red-walled mountains which sloped down to be lost in purple depths. That was the final proof of the strength of nature to soothe, to clarify, to stabilize the tired and weary and upward-gazing soul. Stronger than the recorded deeds of saints, stronger than the eloquence of the gifted uplifters of men, stronger than any words ever written, was the grand, brooding, sculptured aspect of nature. And it must have been so, because thousands of years before the age of saints or preachers, before the fret and symbol and figure were cut in stone, man must have watched with thought-developing sight the wonders of the earth, the monuments of time, the glooming of the dark blue sea, the handiwork of God. In May, Carley returned to Flagstaff to take up with earnest inspiration the labors of home building in a primitive land. It required 2 trucks to transport her baggage and purchases out to Deep Lake. The road was good for 18 miles of that distance. until it branched off to reach her land, and from there it was desert rock and sand. But eventually they made it, and Carley found herself and belongings dumped out into the windy and sunny open. The moment was singularly thrilling and full of transport. She was free. She had shaken off the shackles. She faced lonely, wild, barren desert that must be made habitable by the genius of her direction and the labor of her hands. Always a thought of Glenn hovered tenderly, dreamily, in the back of her consciousness. But she welcomed the opportunity to have a few weeks of work and activity and solitude before taking up her life with him. She wanted to adapt herself to the metamorphosis that had been wrought in her. To her amazement and delight, a very considerable progress had been made with her plans. Under a sheltered red cliff among the cedars had been erected the tents where she expected to live until the house was completed. These tents were large, with board floors high off the ground, and there were 4 of them. Her living tent had a porch under a wide canvas awning. The bed was a box-like affair, raised off the floor 2 feet, and it contained a great fragrant mass of cedar boughs upon which the blankets were to be spread. At one end was a dresser with a large mirror and a chiffonier. There were table and lamp, a low rocking chair, a shelf for books, a row of hooks upon which to hang things, a washstand with its necessary accessories, a little stove, and a neat stack of cedar chips and sticks. Navajo rugs on the floor lent brightness and comfort. Carley heard the rustling of cedar branches over her head and saw where they brushed against the tent roof. It appeared warm and fragrant inside and protected from the wind, and a subdued white light filtered through the canvas. Almost she felt like reproving herself for the comfort surrounding her, for she had come West to welcome the hard knocks of primitive life. It took less than an hour to have her trunk stored in one of the spare tents, and to unpack clothes and necessaries for immediate use. Carley donned the comfortable and somewhat shabby outdoor garb she had worn at Oak Creek the year before, and it seemed to be the last thing needed to make her fully realize the glorious truth of the present. "I'm here," she said to her pale yet happy face in the mirror. "The impossible has happened. I have accepted Glenn's life. I have answered that strange call out of the West." She wanted to throw herself on the sunlit woolly blankets of her bed and hug them, to think and think of the bewildering present happiness, to dream of the future, but she could not lie or sit still, nor keep her mind from grasping at actualities and possibilities of this place, nor her hands from itching to do things. It developed presently that she could not have idled away the time even if she had wanted to, for the Mexican woman came for her with smiling gesticulation and jabber that manifestly meant dinner. Carley could not understand many Mexican words, and herein she saw another task. This swarthy woman and her slow-eyed husband favorably impressed Carley. Next to claim her was Hoyle, the superintendent. "Miss Burch," he said, "in the early days we could run up a log cabin in a jiffy. Axes, horses, strong arms, and a few pegs, that was all we needed. But this house you've planned is different. It's good you've come to take the responsibility." Carley had chosen the site for her home on top of the knoll where Glenn had taken her to show her the magnificent view of mountains and desert. Carley climbed it now with beating heart and mingled emotions. 1,000 times already that day, it seemed, she had turned to gaze up at the noble white-clad peaks. They were closer now, apparently looming over her, and she felt a great sense of peace and protection in the thought that they would always be there. But she had not yet seen the desert that had haunted her for a year. When she reached the summit of the knoll and gazed out across the open space, it seemed that she must stand spellbound. How green the cedared foreground! How gray and barren the downward slope! How wonderful the painted steps! The vision that had lived in her memory shrank to nothingness. The reality was immense, more than beautiful, appalling in its isolation, beyond comprehension, with its lure and strength to uplift. But the superintendent drew her attention to the business at hand. Carley had planned an L-shaped house of one story. Some of her ideas appeared to be impractical, and these she abandoned. The framework was up, and half a dozen carpenters were lustily at work with saw and hammer. "We'd have made better progress if this house were in an ordinary place," explained Hoyle. "But you see the wind blows here, so the framework had to be made as solid and strong as possible. In fact, it's bolted to the sills. Both living room and sleeping room were arranged so that the Painted Desert could be seen from one window, and on the other side the whole of the San Francisco mountains. Both rooms were to have open fireplaces. Carley's idea was for service and durability. She thought of comfort in the severe winters of that high latitude, but elegance and luxury had no more significance in her life. Hoyle made his suggestions as to changes and adaptations, and receiving her approval, went on to show her what had already been accomplished. Back on higher ground, a reservoir of concrete was being constructed near an ever-flowing spring of snow water from the peaks. This water was being piped by gravity to the house, and was a matter of greatest satisfaction to Hoyle, for he claimed that it would never freeze in the winter, and would be cold and abundant during the hottest and driest of summers. This assurance solved the most difficult and serious problem of ranch life in the desert. Next Hoyle led Carley down off the knoll to the wide cedar valley adjacent to the lake. He was enthusiastic over its possibilities. 2 small corrals and a large one had been erected, the latter having a low, flat barn connected with it. Ground was already being cleared along the lake where alfalfa and hay were to be raised. Carley saw the blue and yellow smoke from burning brush, and the fragrant odor thrilled her. Mexicans were chopping the cleared cedars into firewood for winter use. The day was spent before she realized it. At sunset, the carpenters and mechanics left in 2 old Ford cars for town. The Mexicans had a camp in the cedars, and the Hoyles had theirs at the spring under the knoll where Carley had camped with Glenn and the Hutters. Carley watched the golden rosy sunset, and as the day ended she breathed deeply, as if in unutterable relief. Supper found her with appetite she had long since lost. Twilight brought cold wind, the staccato bark of coyotes, the flicker of campfires through the cedars. She tried to embrace all her sensations, but they were so rapid and many that she failed. The cold, clear, silent night brought back the charm of the desert. How flaming white the stars! The great spire-pointed peaks lifted cold, pale gray outlines up into the deep, star-studded sky. Carley walked a little to and fro, loath to go to her tent, though tired. She wanted calm, but instead of achieving calmness, she grew more and more towards a strange state of exaltation. Westward, only a matter of 20 or 30 miles, lay the deep rent in the level desert, Oak Creek Canyon. If Glenn had been there, this night would have been perfect, yet almost unendurable. She was again grateful for his absence. What a surprise she had in store for him! And she imagined his face in its change of expression when she met him. If only he never learned of her presence in Arizona until she made it known in person. That she most longed for. Chances were against it, but then her luck had changed. She looked to the eastward, where a pale luminosity of afterglow shone in the heavens. Far distant seemed the home of her childhood, the friends she had scorned and forsaken, the city of complaining and striving millions. If only some miracle might illumine the minds of her friends, as she felt that hers was to be illumined here in the solitude. But she well realized that not all problems could be solved by a call out of the West. Any open and lonely land that might have saved Glenn Kilbourne would have sufficed for her. It was the spirit of the thing and not the letter. It was work of any kind, and not only that of ranch life, not only the raising of hogs. Carley directed stumbling steps toward the light of her tent. Her eyes had not been used to such black shadow along the ground. She had, too, squeamish feminine fears of hydrophobia skunks and nameless animals or reptiles that were imagined denizens of the darkness. She gained her tent and entered. The Mexican Gino, as he called himself, had lighted her lamp and fire. Carley was chilled through, and the tent felt so warm and cozy that she could scarcely believe it. She fastened the screen door, laced the flaps across it, except at the top, and then gave herself up to the lulling and comforting heat. There were plans to perfect, innumerable things to remember, a car and accessories, horses, saddles, outfits to buy. Carley knew that she should sit down at her table and write and figure, but she could not do it then. For a long time she sat over the little stove, toasting her knees and hands, adding some chips now and then to the red coals, and her mind seemed a kaleidoscope of changing visions, thoughts, feelings. At last she undressed and blew out the lamp and went to bed. Instantly a thick blackness seemed to enfold her, and silence as of a dead world settled down upon her. Drowsy as she was, she could not close her eyes nor refrain from listening. Darkness and silence were tangible things. She felt them, and they seemed suddenly potent with magic charm to still the tumult of her, to soothe and rest, and to create thoughts she had never thought before. Rest was more than selfish indulgence. Loneliness was necessary to gain consciousness of the soul. Already far back in the past seemed Carley's other life. By and by the dead stillness awoke to faint sounds not before perceptible to her. A low, mournful sough of the wind in the cedars. Then the faint, far distant note of a coyote, sad as the night and infinitely wild. Days passed. Carley worked in the mornings with her hands and her brains. In the afternoons she rode and walked and climbed with the double object to work herself into fit physical condition and to explore every nook and corner of her 640 acres. Then what she had expected and deliberately induced by her efforts quickly came to pass. Just as the year before she had suffered excruciating pain from aching muscles and saddle blisters and walking blisters and a very rending of her bones, so now she fell victim to them again. In sunshine and rain she faced the desert. Sunburn and sting of sleet were equally to be endured. But that abomination, the hateful blinding sandstorm, did not daunt her. But the weary hours of abnegation to this physical torture at least held one consoling recompense as she compared with her experiences of last year. It was that there was no one interested to watch her weakness and failures and blunders. She could fight it out alone. 3 weeks of this self-imposed strenuous training wore by before Carley was free enough from weariness and pain to experience other sensations. Her general health evidently had not been so good as when she had first visited Arizona. She caught cold and suffered other ills attendant upon an abrupt change of climate and condition. But doggedly she kept at her task. She rode when she should have been in bed. She walked when she should have ridden. She climbed when she should have kept to level ground. And finally, by degrees so gradual as not to be noticed except in the sum of them, she began to mend. Meanwhile, the construction of her house went on with uninterrupted rapidity. When the low slanting, wide-eaved roof was completed, Carley lost further concern about rainstorms. Let them come. When the plumbing was all in, and Carley saw a verification of Hoyle's assurance that it would mean a gravity supply of water ample and continual, she lost her last concern as to the practicability of the work. That and the earnings of her endurance seemed to bring closer a wonderful reward, still nameless and spiritual, that had been unattainable, but now breathed to her on the fragrant desert wind and in the brooding silence. The time came when each afternoon's ride or climb called to Carley with increasing delight. but the fact that she must soon reveal to Glenn her presence and transformation did not seem to be all the cause. She could ride without pain, walk without losing her breath, work without blistering her hands. And in this there was compensation. The building of the house that was to become a home, the development of water resources and land that meant the making of a ranch, these did not altogether constitute the anticipation of content. To be active, to accomplish things, to recall to mind her knowledge of manual training, of domestic science, of designing and painting, to learn to cook, these were indeed measures full of reward. But they were not all. In her wondering, pondering meditation, she arrived at the point where she tried to assign to her love the growing fullness of her life. This, too, splendid and all-pervading as it was, she had to reject. Some exceedingly elusive and vital significance of life had insidiously come to Carley. One afternoon, with a sky full of white and black rolling clouds and a cold wind sweeping through the cedars, she halted to rest and escape the chilling gale for a while. In a sunny place, under the lee of a gravel bank, she sought refuge. It was warm here because of the reflected sunlight and the absence of wind. The sand at the bottom of the bank held a heat that felt good to her cold hands. All about her and over her swept the keen wind, rustling the sage, seeping the sand, swishing the cedars, but she was out of it, protected and insulated. The sky above showed blue between the threatening clouds. There were no birds or living creatures in sight. Certainly the place had little of color or beauty or grace, nor could she see beyond a few rods. Lying there, without any particular reason that she was conscious of, she suddenly felt shot through and through with exhilaration. Another day, the warmest of the spring so far, she rode a Navajo mustang she had recently bought from a passing trader, and at the farthest end of her section, in rough wooded and ridged ground she had not explored, she found a canyon with red walls and pine trees and gleaming streamlet and glades of grass and jumbles of rocks. It was a miniature canyon, to be sure, only a quarter of a mile long and as deep as the height of a lofty pine, and so narrow that it seemed only the width of a lane. But it had all the features of Oak Creek Canyon, and so sufficed for the exultant joy of possession. She explored it. The willow brakes and oak thickets harbored rabbits and birds. She saw the white flags of deer running away down the open. Up at the head, where the canyon boxed, she flushed a flock of wild turkeys. They ran like ostriches and flew like great brown chickens. In a cavern Carley found the den of a bear, and in another place the bleached bones of a steer. She lingered here in the shaded depths with a feeling as if she were indeed lost to the world. These big brown and seamy barked pines, with their spreading gnarled arms and webs of green needles, belonged to her, as also the tiny brook, the bluebell smiling out of the ferns, the single stalk of mescal on a rocky ledge. Never had sun and earth, tree and rock, seemed a part of her being until then. She would become a sun worshiper and a lover of the earth. That canyon had opened there to sky and light for millions of years, and doubtless it had harbored sheep herders, Indians, cliff dwellers, barbarians. She was a woman with white skin and a cultivated mind, but the affinity for them existed in her. She felt it, and that an understanding of it would be good for body and soul. Another day she found a little grove of jack pines growing on a flat mesa-like bluff, the highest point on her land. The trees were small and close together, mingling their green needles overhead with their discarded brown ones on the ground. From here Carley could see afar to all points of the compass, the slow green descent to the south, and a climb to the black timbered distance, the ridged and canyoned country to the west, red vents choked with green and rimmed with gray. To the north, the grand upflung mountain kingdom crowned with snow, and to the east the vastness of illimitable space, the openness and wildness, the chaste and beaten mosaic of colored sands and rocks. Again and again she visited this lookout and came to love its isolation, its command of wondrous prospects, its power of suggestion to her thoughts. She became a creative being in harmony with the live things around her. The great life-dispensing sun poured its rays down upon her as if to ripen her, and the earth seemed warm, motherly, immense with its all-embracing arms. She no longer plucked the bluebells to press to her face, but leaned to them. Every blade of grama grass, with its shining bronze-tufted seed head, had significance to her. The scents of the desert began to have meanings for her. She sensed within her the working of a great leveling process through which supreme happiness would come. June. The rich, thick amber light, like a transparent reflection from some intense golden medium, seemed to float in the warm air. The sky became an azure blue. In the still noontides, when the bees hummed drowsily and the flies buzzed, vast creamy white columnar clouds rolled up from the horizon, like colossal ships with bulging sails. And summer, with its rush of growing things, was at hand. Carley rode afar, seeking in strange places the secret that eluded her. Only a few days now until she would ride down to Oak Creek Canyon. There was a low, singing melody of wind in the cedars. The earth became too beautiful in her magnified sight. A great truth was dawning upon her, that the sacrifice of what she had held as necessary to the enjoyment of life, the strain of conflict, the labor of hands, the forcing of weary body, the enduring of pain, the contact with the earth, had served somehow to rejuvenate her blood, quicken her pulse, intensify her sensorial faculties, thrill her very soul, lead her into the realm of enchantment. One afternoon a dull, lead black colored cinder knoll tempted her to explore its bare heights. She rode up until her mustang sank to his knees and could climb no farther. From there she essayed the ascent on foot. It took labor, but at last she gained the summit, burning, sweating, panting. The cinder hill was an extinct crater of a volcano. In the center of it lay a deep bowl, wondrously symmetrical, and of a dark, lusterless hue. Not a blade of grass was there, nor a plant. Carley conceived a desire to go to the bottom of this pit. She tried the cinders at the edge of the slope. They had the same consistency as those of the ascent she had overcome. But here there was a steeper incline. A tingling rush of daring seemed to drive her over the rounded rim, and once started down, it was as if she wore 7-league boots. Fear left her. Only an exhilarating emotion consumed her. If there were danger, it mattered not. She strode down with giant steps. She plunged. She started avalanches to ride them until they stopped. She leaped, and lastly she fell to roll over the cinders to the pit. There she lay. It seemed a comfortable resting place. The pit was scarcely 6 feet across. She gazed upward and was astounded. How steep was the rounded slope on all sides! There were no sides. It was a circle. She looked up at a round lake of deep translucent sky. Such depth of blue! Such exquisite rare color! Carley imagined she could gaze through it to the infinite beyond. She closed her eyes and rested. Soon the laboring of her heart and breath calmed to normal, so that she could not hear them. Then she lay perfectly motionless. With eyes shut she seemed still to look, and what she saw was the sunlight through the blood and flesh of her eyelids. It was red, as rare a hue as the blue sky. So piercing did it grow that she had to shade her eyes with her arm. Again the strange, rapt glow suffused her body. Never in all her life had she been so absolutely alone. She might as well have been in her grave. She might have been dead to all earthly things and reveling in spirit in the glory of the physical that had escaped her in life. And she had abandoned herself to this influence. She loved these dry, dusty cinders. She loved the crater here hidden from all save birds. She loved the desert, the earth, above all the sun. She was a product of the earth, a creation of the sun. She had been an infinitesimal atom of inert something that had quickened to life under the blazing magic of the sun. Soon her spirit would abandon her body and go on, while her flesh and bone returned to dust. This frame of hers that carried the divine spark belonged to the earth. She had only been ignorant, mindless, feelingless, absorbed in the seeking of gain, blind to the truth. She was to give. She had been created a woman. She belonged to nature. She was nothing save a mother of the future. She had loved neither Glenn Kilbourne nor life itself. False education, false standards, false environment had developed her into a woman who imagined that she must feed her body on the milk and honey of indulgence. She was abased now. Woman is animal, though saved and uplifted by her power of immortality. Transcendental was her female power to link life with the future. The power of the plant seed, the power of the earth, the heat of the sun, the inscrutable creation spirit of nature, almost the divinity of God. These were all hers because she was a woman. That was the great secret, aloof so long. That was what had been wrong with life, the woman blind to her meaning, her power, her mastery. So she abandoned herself to the woman within her. She held out her arms to the blue abyss of heavens as if to embrace the universe. She was nature. She kissed the dusty cinders and pressed her breast against the warm slope. Her heart swelled to bursting with a glorious and unutterable happiness. That afternoon, as the sun was setting under a gold-white scroll of cloud, Carley got back to Deep Lake. A familiar lounging figure crossed her sight. It approached to where she had dismounted. Charley, the sheep herder of Oak Creek. "Howdy," he drawled with his queer smile. "So it was you all who had this Deep Lake section?" "Yes, and how are you, Charley?" she replied, shaking hands with him. "Me? Oh, I'm tip-top. I'm sure glad you got this ranch. Reckon I'll hit you for a job." "I'd give it to you. But aren't you working for the Hutters?" "Nope, not any more. Me and Stanton had a row with them." How droll and dry he was! His lean, olive brown face, with its guileless, clear eyes, and his lanky figure in blue jeans, vividly recalled Oak Creek to Carley. "Oh, I'm sorry," returned she haltingly, somehow checked in her warm rush of thought. "Stanton, did he quit too?" "Yup, he sure did." "What was the trouble?" "Reckon because Flo made up to Kilbourne," replied Charley with a grin. "Ah, I see," murmured Carley. A blankness seemed to wave over her. It extended to the air without, to the sense of the golden sunset. It passed. What should she ask? What of a thousand sudden flashing questions? "Are the Hutters back?" "Sure. Been back several days. I reckon Hoyle told you. Maybe he didn't know, though, for nobody's been to town." "How is he? How are they all?" faltered Carley. There was a strange wall here between her thought and her utterance. "Everybody's satisfied, I reckon," replied Charley. "Flo, how is she?" burst out Carley. "Ah, Flo's loony over her husband," drawled Charley, his clear eyes on Carley's. "Husband?" she gasped. "Sure. Flo's gone and went and done what I swore on." "Who?" whispered Carley, and the query was a terrible blade piercing her heart. "Now who d'you reckon on?" asked Charley with a slow grin. Carley's lips were mute. "Well, it was your old beau that you wouldn't have," returned Charley, as he gathered up his long frame, evidently to leave. "Kilbourne. He and Flo came back from the Tonto all hitched up." End of Chapter 11, Part 2.